you heard in the, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, glad we can start this second part of the first session. As you heard in the first part, some very interesting points raised. Some of the issues highlight where the debate can go now as we open up the discussion for your participation too. I would ask that if you have questions, you put your hands up, and I'll get to those hands in the order in which I see them. I promise I'll try and make sure we can do that. I don't know, do we have microphones that we're running around? I think we may have a couple of microphones. I'll make sure we can get a microphone to you if we do. Let me just check. Anyway, but either way, let me kick off initially though and highlight some of the things that were said in that first part, which I think might help promote some of the discussion. And if I could start with Maruf al-Bakit, who's sitting to my immediate left. He made some very interesting points, but I want to put something that came from the other side, or at least from one of our other panelists. Saying, and it was Colette Avital who pointed out that in Israel there is an existential fear that something, that there is a problem, that there's something bad. It's not just a political fear, it's actually a fear for the lives of the people. And I ask perhaps Maruf al-Bakit whether there's a way the Arab world can recognize what's being said by Ms. Colette Avital and perhaps respond in trying to make the Israelis feel less threatened and that there is a genuine wish towards peace.
Thank you, Riz. Actually, in the Arab Initiative, there was a paragraph talking about collective security guarantees. In fact, unfortunately, as far as the Arab Initiative, the Arabs did not do enough, and the Israelis thought this is a public relation ploy. Did not enough to introduce it to the Israeli public. From the Israeli public, again, there is a blame that it was not put to discussions in the research centers, in the intellectual circles in Israel. They never asked the questions, what kind of guarantees you're saying? So I thought that it could be discussed that either a collective security kind of pact, a regime in the area, including Israel and the Arab states. And I still believe that the Palestinians do not pose an existential threat to Israel. It is the Arab states that they hold the key to Israel's security. And probably joining the NATO, it could be discussed. Israel, join the NATO if you want, if you feel more secure. So it could be put for public discussion, and the blame is on both sides, actually. We did not do enough to explain the Arab Initiative to the Israeli public, and the Israelis did not really discuss it as well openly. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Also throwing out more of the points, but perhaps Colette Avital, I could put something to you that Dr. Ahmed Tibi said, and that is that Israel doesn't want to end the occupation, it just wants to rearrange it.
That depends about whom you speak. I think a majority of the Israelis would like to end that occupation. I think that they are conscious of the fact that the price which is being paid is also paid very, very deeply by the Israeli society, by the divisiveness, by the fact that we, as a result of this conflict, have become also a very violent kind of society which didn't exist before. So if you're asking about the current government or of some of the elements in the government, maybe Ahmed Tibi is right. I wouldn't make the generalization. I also don't think that this is the most, that we can by now say that this is the most far-right radical government that we've had. When Prime Minister, when Ariel Sharon became the Prime Minister, we were all afraid that this is going to happen. In fact, I remember having lunch one day with Akiva Eldar, and both of us were saying that if Sharon becomes Prime Minister, we will buy a house in Provence. And at the end of the day, we saw that experience, the materials they were exposed to, the fact that they understood that it's no longer tenable, that Israel cannot pursue this policy of occupation, at the end brings governments, at the end, to a more moderate kind of an attitude. Now, one more thing which I would like to say, and that is that when Netanyahu was elected, a lot of talk was in the air about what kind of options does he have. would he become a kind of a leader like Begin, Likud, or Shamir? And it looks today like he has chosen the option of being somebody like Shamir, who doesn't want to move, doesn't want to change, is not ready for change. I think that it is up to us, and certainly up to the American administration, and up to the world at large, to explain to Netanyahu that the Shamir option is not really realistic. He cannot afford it. Because one of the things which I believe he understands, and many Israelis do understand, is that we are not in the same strategic position that we were in the past, that our situation today is much more difficult, much more complex. Somebody like Shamir thought we're on top of the world. I think that he doesn't think we're on top of the world. And I believe that even he understands that there has to be an end of occupation. How he will deal with it, I do not know. But this is the basic message, that I don't think that the Israeli society at large wants to rearrange the occupation.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ahmed Tibi, one of the things that has come up, I mean, of course, we're talking with people like Colette Avital and Yossi Belin who see the value in peace. Of course, as she's just indicated, not everyone in Israel is necessarily of that view. One thing I wonder, when you hear Yossi Belin say, there may be a majority wanting to move forward, but he hadn't taken into account the power of the minority to torpedo results. From the inside, you're there in the Knesset, what do you see in terms of the kind of perhaps disproportionate power minorities have in shaping Israel's policies?
First of all, I want to say and to agree that the vast majority of both Israelis and Palestinians are willing to have a so-called two-state solution. But it depends how every side is perceiving the two-state solution, the independent Palestinian state or the Palestinian state. Why I am saying rearranging occupation? Because the vast majority of Israel are not willing, not accepting the withdrawal of the whole East Jerusalem area occupied at 1967, mainly the holy places, the vast majority. When you are talking about minority veto, it is not in the Knesset. I am the minority. Yossi Belin was the minority. Colette Avital was the minority. The majority is rightist. The majority is saying no to any withdrawal from East Jerusalem. The majority is saying no to total freeze of settlement activity. We are the minority. We are trying to change that, but we are failing once again. That's why I am saying that to say that I am accepting the idea of Palestinian state is no more a challenge, because once in the past it was said by the leftists in Israel, courageous leftists in Israel, today even Netanyahu and Lieberman are talking about Palestinian state. Which kind of Palestinian state? This is the most crucial and important issue. I think that the maximum that Mr. Netanyahu and his coalition can accept is the wall state, Palestinian state in the areas and the borders of the separation wall. Look, the Palestinians accepted historical compromise by the agreement for independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, which is 23% of Great Palestine. Then, from this 23%, Mr. Netanyahu and this Israeli government is saying, East Jerusalem is out, okay? Now, from the West Bank, we are not talking about the whole West Bank, Netanyahu is saying. We are talking about so-called the wall state, which is almost 8% no one Palestinian leader can accept this dwarf Palestinian state. We are talking about the Arab Initiative, as Prime Minister Bakhit said, is a historical, unprecedented compromise delivered by the whole Arab world, whole Arab and Islamic world, to the government of Israel with negligence and apathy of the Israeli government towards this important Arab initiative. I do believe that the Arabs are not doing enough in order to market the Arab initiative. They should do more. I do believe that the American administration should do more in their endorsement to this Arab initiative. Meanwhile, the atmosphere is very extreme in both sides, and the gap is huge.
Dr. Ahmed, thank you very much. Microphone there. Robert Wexler, interesting, you were talking about America's role and what it can and can't achieve. Maruf al-Bakhit said at the beginning, quoting Kissinger, the US relies on crisis management. And of course, with the Middle East, has been pushed largely to the side, with Afghanistan and Iraq being on the agenda for the last few years. I think it's recognized that it's in the US national security interests to have a solution in the Middle East. When General Petraeus made that comment that it was in the interests of the US to sort out the Middle East situation, the Israeli-Palestinian situation, it caused quite a stir. What needs to change in America? What needs to change among the American leadership to recognize perhaps that a solution is crucial, and now, not later?
Well, I would respectfully beg to differ just a little bit with the predicate. America's efforts in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were not pushed aside because of the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. That's a cop-out. America's efforts were pushed aside by an intifada, by the war in Gaza, by the war in Lebanon, by the actions of the parties and the conditions on the ground. They weren't pushed aside because America decided, oh, we're going to go pursue other avenues. It was not ripe. And if we put this in a historical conflict or a context, Barack Obama took office as the Gaza campaign finished and immediately committed himself and his administration to using that crisis as an opportunity. And if you listen to the participants today, as much frustration as there's actually, and I think this was part of Yossi Beiling's point, there's an enormous amount of consensus. And the American challenge is, in the middle of all this frustration, in the middle of this chronic mistrust, to take that consensus and build upon it. But it's very difficult, with all due respect. When the President of the United States goes to Cairo to make an historic speech and stops in Riyadh to meet with the King of Saudi Arabia, and the President has made mistakes, America has made mistakes, admittedly, but he didn't get much of a helping hand, let's all be candid, from the King of Saudi Arabia. When he asks other actors to join with him, it's a push and tug. So the real question is not, as we divert our attention to Iraq or Afghanistan, the President has said in the most unequivocal of terms, Israeli-Palestinian resolving the conflict is in the national security interests of the United States of America. What more can the President say than that? We are the superpower, for better or worse, 310 million people. And the President of the United States is saying that this historic conflict is in our national security interests. So the question is, it seems to me, how does the President not impose a peace, but how does he gently, and it's sometimes a little more than gently, push both sides to an equilibrium where then the President can close the gaps? That's what he can do. But he can't do it alone. He can't do it in isolation. And I can't second guess Israelis because I don't know enough. But I don't think it's premature to ask whether Prime Minister Netanyahu, it seems to me, is Shamir or Begin, because he actually hasn't been presented with the choice yet. And we've got to get to that decision-making point.
So thank you very much. If I may, President Fernandez, get you in here. You've been waiting very patiently as our host in your beautiful country, and we appreciate that. Listening to the comments you heard in the first session and hear what's been going on, and listening to what Robert Wexler, a former congressman in the US, had to say, it's interesting, you know, when you said as the world's only superpower, I have more and more people now, when I say, you know, America, the only superpower, they say, well, it's not really a superpower, the only superpower anymore. China's just become the biggest consumer market. It's taken over from the US. The power is shifting. And I wonder, when you hear what's being said, A, what you see as the role, sir, of countries like yours in this kind of process, how you see outside interests that don't have the baggage, perhaps, of the Middle East on their doorstep can help. And then secondly, you've got mostly a panel here who do want to hold hands for peace. What do you think might have been said by someone who is much more hawkish, perhaps from, like, say, if we had Benjamin Netanyahu here, what would he be saying, do you think?
Well, let me say what I think first. And just listening to the different panelists, I would also indicate that we here in the Dominican Republic also have a national security interest in trying to make a contribution to peace in the Middle East. Why? Because, as I said last night, if there is an escalation in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, or in the Middle East as a whole, it will have impact on oil prices. And when you have an increase in oil prices, it will create instability in our macroeconomic system. So our economy gets affected because of a conflict in the region there. So there is a national Dominican interest in making a contribution to peace in the area. But as I said last night, it also has to do with our own identity as a nation. We have Jewish families, we have Arab families here in the Dominican Republic. They are very much concerned, very much aware and engaged in trying to push forward a peace process in the area. Now, what can a small country in Latin America that has not played a significant role in peacemaking in the region can do? What I think is that we can create some sort of connection with other Latin American countries where we have civil society organizations that could be interested. We have at the UN level, GRULAC, which are the different Latin American countries represented at the UN. And coming with all these forces together, the modest contribution that we can make is perhaps creating a momentum for peace in the region. So it has to do more with this subjective idea of creating a momentum for peace that will leave aside the hawkish side of people who don't see any possibility of a peaceful resolution to the problem from the Israeli side and from the Palestinian side. The radicals on both sides that do not create the proper environment to move on with a peaceful resolution. To Mr. Netanyahu, what we see from Latin America is that one major issue has to do with the settlements. And the US president has only indicated as a precondition to the negotiations that the settlements be frozen. But instead of freezing the settlements continue. So it indicates somehow that there is not a political will to really move on with the peace process. Now, I have heard here, which is also something of great interest, the lack of trust, the chronic mistrust, which brings us to another dimension of the problem in every conflict, the emotional human side to all this, which I think also has to be taken into consideration to come to a final solution to the problem.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Mohammed Abdullah, if I could move to you with a couple of issues that were raised. The issue of lack of trust was one thing. Colette Avital also spoke about the lack of courage to implement solutions as well. And there is a sense from our panelists, for example, Robert Wexler, saying the Arab world hasn't stepped up and done its part. It hasn't done enough to show it's committed to the same level of peace, perhaps. Your view on how that might be changed?
Thank you, Mr. Khan, but I believe that just saying the statement this way is not fair, because I believe it's the Arab side, okay, it was at that time the Egyptian side, which was the initiative taken by late President Anwar Sadat, who changed totally the mind and the mentality and the spirit of the area. Then this was followed, maybe a little bit later, and I remember one declaration of Sadat to the American television. He said, I was attending when he was giving this interview, I think it was with Barbara Walters, and he said that I am optimistic that sooner or later all the others will follow our steps. And it happened that the Arab countries, and started by Jordan, the Palestinians, who are the main key player, because when you talk about national security, and the word has been said several times, I believe that for two countries, mainly, okay, the Palestinian problem is the core of the Arab problems in general. It's deeply rooted in our soul and in our heart. But when we look at a national security, it's for Jordan and for Egypt. It's very important to solve the Palestinian problem. We want to have stability on our borders. So when you have a Palestinian state, which also could not be, it could be looked upon as a buffer zone, but it could be looked upon as a bridge between Jordan, Egypt, and Israel, I believe this is very important, and this is, from the strategic viewpoint, is something that nobody can argue as far as our concerns with the Palestinian problem. But the real problem is that in the mentality, here we have really the elite of the peace lovers in Israel with us. But in the mentality of some hawkish in Israel, they thought that the peace with Egypt and the peace with Jordan later on meant that, it's hands-off of the Palestinian problem. And this was a historical wrong assessment from their side. Maybe they were helped at that time of some of the, extremist position taken by some Arab countries and so on. On the contrary, we think that this is an example that would open and put the real basis for future peace. It's land for peace. This is what happened between Egypt and Israel. This should happen one day with Syria and Israel. But still, we cannot talk about real and comprehensive peace in this part of the world without a fair solution to the Palestinian problem. And also, you have here leaders of the moderate Palestinian leadership. If we don't work hard and if we don't work quickly, we are going to discredit those people vis-a-vis the others who will say your policy is a failure, and then the extremists will be the winners. And this is why I always underline the fact that the challenge today is that we who are working for peace are going to make it, or we will leave it for years to come after a kind of confrontation whatsoever it will take, this limited or not limited or several wars between the extremists in both sides.
So thank you. Actually, it's interesting when you say the word Palestinian problem, as you mentioned a couple of times. I always think about my profession, the media, which is often guilty, usually guilty, for perpetuating stereotypes. These are why expressions such as Muslim terrorist or Arab terrorist and Muslim fundamentalist extremist go into the general dialogue and they're very hard to remove. I always illustrate it with the story of a man who was walking through, young man walking through Central Park, came across an elderly lady being attacked by a dog. And he ran and helped the lady, and he shooed away the dog and saved her from this dog attack. And a local reporter in New York happened to hear about this and tracked down the young man, and he said, listen, I want to do a story on this. I can see it now. Local hero saves senior citizen from dog attack in Central Park. And the young man said, well, I'm actually not from New York, I'm not local. He said, oh, no, don't worry, I see the headline now. American hero saves pensioner from dog attack. He said, well, actually, I'm not American, I'm actually from the Middle East, I'm a student here. And the headline the next day said, local dog attacked by Arab terrorist. So it makes you realize how in the media we're responsible for some of these. And so just a quick follow-up to what you said. Is part of the issue in the Middle East that it's seen as the Palestinian problem, and that it's become a problem for the Arab nations, and less of a cause or less of a challenge that needs to be dealt with, rather than seen as a problem that they themselves face? Egypt, of course, came under a lot of criticism during the Gaza issue recently because of the tunnels and the barricades. Go ahead. Yeah.
You know, the problem for us was that we don't want to allow, and we will not allow, the separation of the Palestinian land between Gaza and the West Bank. This is our strategy. We cannot play the game, even with all the media pushed by Hamas or not Hamas. There is two issues. We want the unity of the Palestinian land. We are fighting to have a Palestinian state. We are not accepting to create a de facto division between the Palestinian land. Secondly, when it comes to national security, sometimes, you know, it is a priority.
So thank you very much. Yossi Beilin, you know, one of the things, you know, you've been through the peace process fairly extensively, and one of the things that Dr. Mohammed Abdullah raised is the younger generations are being challenged by fresh issues, such as Gaza, such as the attack on Lebanon. And I wonder if that baggage is being renewed. I mean, you know, we've talked about this sort of offline, about how there are generations carrying baggage with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that it's hard for them to shed, that new leadership, some fresh ideas might help move things along. I wonder, with the new kind of incidents that come up, Gaza and Lebanon and so on, whether it's going to ever be possible for a generation to be raised in the region not feeling the burden of these kind of issues.
Well, I must say that I beg to differ with my friend Professor Shibli about this issue. I'm much more optimistic about the almost unbearable ease of people to change. You know, the example of 70% of the Israelis against the Camp David Accords in '78, and before it was agreed, and 70% morning after supporting the Camp David Accords when they were signed, people tend to be optimistic. I mean, after all the years of occupation in '93, people hugged Israeli, in Palestine, hugged Israeli soldiers. Now, of course, bad things are happening to both sides, but there is a human readiness to overcome these problems when there is hope for the future. I may exaggerate. I'm blamed for being too optimistic, and sometimes it was vindicated. So maybe I'm wrong, but this is my feeling is, if we have peace, it is most up to the leadership. Of course, they have to feel that they have some backing, and they have backing. By the way, they have more than a small majority for the Clinton parameters, or even the Geneva parameters, which went further. We are checking it twice a year. Not just whether you want a Palestinian state. We are checking all the parameters in detail about Jerusalem and whatever. It is changing, but you have a majority of between 55 and 65. Of course, if you ask about Jerusalem separately, you have a minority supporting it. But if you ask about the package, and it is in the package, you have a majority. So this is something that I'm not, I mean, of course, Lebanon has an impact and Gaza has an impact, but it will be surmounted once there is a solution. But if I may just refer to the President's remark, Dr. Fernandez, if I may refer to my own experience. I really admire the idea of such involvement. I think that other countries underestimate the power they have. You don't have to be the United States of America, which has its own power. It is still the only superpower in the world, and I hope that it will remain such. But it doesn't mean that others do not have their power. The problem that I envisaged in the experience of the last 30 years is that this involvement of the third party should be flexible. The European involvement, like the Venice Declaration of June 1980, was possible because Europe was then with only 9 members. With 27 members, Europe lost totally its ability to impact the situation. It may finance or whatever. When I try to begin my long odysseus in this story, I try to go to Europe and suggest secret talks with PLO. No European member of the EU agreed to it. I went to Oslo only because they were not part of the EU. And they agreed to facilitate. And Norway is a small country. And people ask, why Norway? Norway decided at a certain point that it might be interesting for it, for different reasons. They even have oil. But still, they believed that it would be interesting for them because they have their own vision and ideology or whatever to be involved. And they were ready to facilitate. Immediately, they became very, very critical. And then with the agreement with Abu Mazen in 1995, it took place in Stockholm. Why in Stockholm? Because Sweden was not yet a member of the EU. And then the Geneva Initiative was taken in Switzerland. Why? Because it was not part of the EU. And if you try to have a kind of a Latin American coalition, believe me, you will waste half of your work, if not more, of having a consensus in this coalition. With this consensus, you will eradicate your ability to be involved in the process itself, if I may say so.
Yossi Beilin, thank you very much. Actually, President Fernandez, if I could get a response from you on that, is it safer to stay solo, or do you really feel you need to get partners from the region?
Well, I do agree with what you have just said, and I was referring to GRULAC, for example, as an organization within the UN, Latin American countries represented at that level. And I know about the difficulties of having a consensus built there within the Latin American governments. So I think we have to go through different approaches. The idea of having a Latin American coalition is because you will have the backing of a whole continent with 550 million people. There is a tradition of Arab families and Jewish families in the region that we can somehow use as a leverage, to have some sort of participation in contributing to a peace solution to the situation in the Middle East. But if you consider that the Dominican Republic and its own, just because we are interested, that we are involved, that we are concerned, that we care, that we can have some sort of participation in making a contribution, I mean, we feel that with a sense of pride that we can be able to do that. But if we can also attract more players from the region who are also willing to play an active and dynamic role in promoting democracy and promoting peace and promoting a solution that can be beneficial to all the parties, let be it. So we'll try to do our best. But the thing is that perhaps this conference we might consider as a major breakthrough in having a country like the Dominican Republic taking a step forward and say we also want to actively participate in finding a solution to this conflict that has gone just too far, too much bloodshed, and it's not understood as irrational, and the world must keep going on. So I appreciate your comment, and I agree with what you have said. Perhaps the Dominican Republic can be the Oslo of the Caribbean. All right.
Professor Shibli Tilhami, something that Maruf al-Bakid said at the beginning was incremental peace is no longer debatable. It's been disastrous. Are we reaching a point where there has to be an all or nothing, that these little steps aren't really going anywhere?
In some ways, actually, that connects to the issue that Yossi just raised about what I meant by the mistrust issue. And I think that actually in some ways Yossi made my point for me, because if you look at the cases where we had transformations on the Arab-Israeli front, largely the Egyptian-Israeli treaty and really the Oslo agreement that Yossi was part of, where you had breakthroughs. There were breakthroughs, very important agreements, unexpected, by the way, unpredictable. If you look back in before Sadat undertook his initiative and looked at the analysts of predicting, what was going to happen, no one predicted it. And the same thing in 1993. I think end of 1992, people were very pessimistic about the prospects. It happened. Now, once they happened, Arabs and Israelis embraced them. Certainly in the case of the Egyptians and Israelis embraced them, Palestinians and Israelis embraced them, even though they were unpredictable and there were, major transformations. So yes, publics will turn around, and they can, and often leaders often leaders underestimate how much power they have once they act to sway up to a quarter or 30% of the public that is sitting on the sidelines the minute they put something dramatic on the table that people will latch onto. So I agree with that. Where I disagree is that if you think that you can build trust before you put something on the table, I think it's too late for that. It's too late for that. Because what happened, if you look at the Egyptian-Israeli treaty, there was no attempt to build trust across the board. And the same thing before Oslo, there was no attempt to build the trust. It came after you put something on the table that people can accept or can relate to, and they have to make choices. I take it or I won't take it. And I think people are not, if we're going to go into a tactic, let's try to rebuild trust and then get to an agreement or negotiations, people are not going to have faith in promises anymore. They paid too heavy a price for believing. And that was the legacy of Oslo in the end, is that people invested in it. They thought the end of conflict was coming. They planned their lives accordingly, and then suddenly it came to a crash, and they're just not prepared to pay another price until they have something tangible to hold. So I think incrementalism is over, personally, on the Israeli-Palestinian front. I think it's too late for that. I think it's too late for that because of the transformation on the ground, certainly one aspect, but it's too late for that because of the disbelief. I think that if you look at the intellectual transformation, what it took a whole generation of Israelis and Palestinians to come to the point of recognizing each other's national plight in some ways. A whole generation. The big breakthrough in Oslo was the transformation of the Palestinian movement, the way people saw themselves. And now you have walking away from that. You have the trend, whether it's a religious idea or even a seemingly liberal idea of a single state. That's where the trend is. And I think you cannot arrest that trend. The trend is moving too fast. And I do not believe that we're at a point where you can think of an incremental way of managing the conflict or resolving it. I think we are in need for a far more dramatic action to end at least the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which obviously is tied to a broader conflict in the region.
Professor, thank you very much, sir. Let's see if any hands are going up. We've got one there. I don't know if we have any microphones. If not, oh yeah, we do. Okay, wonderful. Keep your hand up so they can see where to bring the microphone, and then if there's any others, put your hands up and I'll get to you as well. Let us know who you are and where you're from. It will help our panelists also to get an assessment of where the question comes from. Sorry, it's not on yet. Let's keep trying. It may be on, but it's not been brought up. Just make sure it's on and just keep speaking.
It's on. My name is Ashraf Swilim. I'm from Egypt. I listened to what have been said today, and I can't help think the following, especially in reference to the incremental approach and jumping to final status negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And while it's tempting, and I agree that we dismiss the incremental approach. I would like to caution against jumping into immediately into final status negotiations without having the conditions on the ground, because I think, as all the panelists agree, the results of failure will be disastrous. And I would like whoever from the panelists to comment on that. Second quick question is to follow up on something that Professor Telhami mentioned about a strategic shift taking place before conditions on the ground need to change. I would like to ask Professor Telhami to expand on that a little bit. I am on the pessimistic side. I don't think anything will be achieved in the short to mid-term. But I also one who believe that the current administration in the US provides a great opportunity. Probably not necessarily to pushing the process towards the end to a final negotiation, but I was wondering what are the dynamics that are taking place in the Middle East, and how can we use these dynamics taking into consideration the presence of the current US administration, so that at the end of this administration we are in a better place than we are now.
Let's get the first part I'd like to actually put to Maruf al-Bahid, please, because it was his comment about incremental peace is no longer debatable. Our esteemed guest is a little bit cynical that there could be final status talks straight away.
Thank you. Actually, there could be a cooling off period, but not to the degree that, I mean, it should be kept to the minimum. Long periods of building confidence, as it was envisaged in the Oslo, actually it was utilized by both sides. Let's be fair. The Palestinians utilized it in smuggling in more small weapons to the security of, to the Palestinian police. While Israelis utilized it to build more settlements actually in the West Bank, which is the most important. Because simply, if you know that you have a next round of negotiations after 2 years or 3 years, you're trying to prepare kind of negotiating chips for yourself, you prepare yourself for the next round. And that's what happened, and that was the disaster. Actually, it should be, if there is a cooling off period, it should be kept to the minimum. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Professor, you're asked that second part there, how this, the position with President Obama and the potential shift in the situation could be utilized.
Well, you know, when you look at the public opinion in the region, and I do public opinion polling every year. I'm actually just about to release the 2010 poll, which I'm analyzing. I'll do it in 2 weeks. And every year it's been very consistent, depending on, regardless of what's happening on the ground, it's been very consistent for the past 4 or 5 years, which is you have 2/3 of the public. By the way, not just Israelis and Palestinians, we're talking about Arabs outside the Palestinian territories as well. 2/3 of the public who say, to this day, even despite the environment, they're prepared to accept a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. But a majority, in some instances 2/3, say they don't believe the other side would ever accept it. You know, that's basically a defining characteristic. So in essence, yes, there is a receptivity, but it's all about, you know, they're not going to bet that the other side will ever accept it until the other side will accept it. And I think we don't need to have that buildup of trust until the deal is put on the table. We can imagine, if you look back at Anwar Sadat and negotiating with Menachem Begin. I wrote a book on the first Camp David negotiations. I interviewed a lot of people. And if you look at Anwar Sadat, Jimmy Carter, who was actually handed a document by Anwar Sadat on the first day of Camp David, which was telling him roughly what his bottom line position was, which is one reason why Carter believed a deal was possible, because Sadat actually confided with him what he was prepared to do. But that didn't include, by the way, having a diplomatic exchange immediately with an embassy with an Israeli flag in Cairo. Sadat said, there is no way my public will accept that. Maybe in 10, 20 years I want to get there, but I want to have an end to conflict. Well, you know, in the end, they had to negotiate. He didn't know how far he was going to go. He did provide that. The Israelis demanded it. He accepted it. And lo and behold, the Egyptian public accepted it. I mean, this was something that he couldn't even contemplate, and he was not doing it as a negotiating tactic. He was negotiating honestly. I think even at Camp David, too, when the Israelis and Palestinians were negotiating, when Ehud Barak went to Jerusalem, and there was no preparation on the issue of Jerusalem whatsoever, and that was a mistake, at least not to probe it in the negotiations. But Barak did things that he probably didn't think he was capable of doing himself. He wasn't prepared for it. And I think had he gone through and we had an agreement, the Israeli public, in my own opinion, would have accepted it. So what I'm saying is, I think that I don't look at public opinion as a barrier. At some point, you have to analyze what the public is prepared to accept on your own, and you have to take some risk. And I think it's more about leadership. And we've come to a point, I think, where without leadership, I cannot envision a protracted negotiation or an incremental approach to bring results. We know roughly what the outcome is. We know what it has to be. We know what is acceptable to both sides. It is hard for me to envision how anybody is going to bet on incrementalism. Problem with incrementalism, by the way, is that it's like what the problem of Barak and Arafat, which is Barak will come, he's committed to providing Arafat with something, or Arafat is committed to providing him with something in the incremental approach. And then Barak looks at his political game and says, well, I have to pay a price just to pull out of this, few hundred meters. Why don't I just wait until there's a final negotiation and pay the big price at the end? So the incrementalism works against you making concessions in a way that erodes confidence even more every step of the way.
Professor, thank you. I'll see if any hands go up. Okay, this gentleman first, and then I'll come to you as well.
Thank you. My name is Diego Ojeda. I'm from Spain. I first would like to thank President Fernandez and Funglode for the fantastic initiative to hold this conference, which I find is incredibly interesting. I would like to, with some years of experience in the Middle East, try to move a little bit beyond the debate on whether we need an honest broker or we need a third party that imposes peace. I think that Oslo, it failed or partially failed for many reasons, among which, of course, as Yossi Beilin mentioned, the death of Rabin or the assassination of Rabin. But I think that it also failed because the debate on whether the parties need to negotiate directly or with a third party that imposes peace is partly wrong or imprecise. Because of the mutual distrust, and Palestinians have plenty of good reasons to not trust the Israelis and vice versa, what is required is obviously an honest broker, República Dominicana, Norway, whoever, the US, but something more important is a third party that's willing to guarantee whatever is negotiated and agreed. And that is what I think has been missing so far, that neither side has received assurances from, not from the UN, but from the US, the EU, that whatever this side is willing to compromise, it will be done, that the third party will make sure that the other party, that the other side will deliver on what it offers. And that has been missing all along, and I think that is the only way to make sure that we can use the positive majority on one side and the positive majority on the other, and assuage the fears of the minorities.
Yossi Beilin and Robert Wexler, I know you had your hand up as well. I'll come to you in a second. But is there, in the current climate, is there anyone that can make that kind of guarantee our guest is talking about, that can actually say, if you do the deal, this is what will be delivered?
Yes, there is only one player who can fulfill this part.
And in a way, it was done in Oslo. I mean, our big fear was on August the 20th or 21st of 93, was whether the Americans will agree to what we did and whether they will be ready to some kind of a role of guarantor to Oslo. And because they preferred, and we did not speak about Syria at all, but they preferred peace between Israel and Syria, not between Israel and the Palestinians. It was their preference, undoubtedly. In a way, we were criticized about hurrying to the Palestinian partner. So we were afraid that once they know it, they might say, okay, it's your deal, be our guests, and do whatever you want. Why do you want us in this story? We were not even involved at the beginning. And this was not the case. And in a way, even PR-wise, Clinton was very intelligent to understand that it was an opportunity for him. And if you ask people in the world about Oslo, they remember only one picture. Tall Clinton with two leaders of the Middle East, Rabin and Arafat. And he became a kind of a guarantor, and he signed as a witness to the agreement. It was something which was not enough. I mean, America did not become the policeman of the Oslo Agreement, although what we actually did, both sides, was to try and convince the Americans that we were fulfilling the agreement and the other side doesn't, and whatever. But they could not or did not play this role. Even between us and the Egyptians, they are playing the same role. They are the guarantors. And you have the MFO in Sinai, led by the Americans. So they are playing such a role. It is important, but it is not vital. Because at the moment of truth, it doesn't help. If there is an eruption of violence, the Americans can say, tough luck. You have to stop it immediately, tomorrow. And if it doesn't stop, they are not sending troops.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, with your permission, I'll go on another 10, 12 minutes so we can get a couple of questions in, sir. Colette Avital, you had your hand up for that. I also wanted to follow up on this idea. There's a view that if Israel doesn't feel strong, it moves away from negotiation. That if there's a sense the U.S. is not backing us, the tensions between Barack Obama and Netanyahu also seem to indicate perhaps that there was the issue of the U.S. not giving Israel the kind of support it might, that Israel backs away and is less inclined to make peace.
I think this assumption is right. I'd like to join Yossi Beilin in saying that at whatever stage of negotiations we were in the past, whether it was with the Egyptians, whether it was with Syria, certainly with the Palestinians, it was understood that America has to be a third party which provides some kind of guarantees, which steps in case of crisis. In terms of, let's say, Syria, it was supposed to be part of a peacekeeping force. Now, I would say that it's not only the guarantee which is important. In the case, let's say, of security arrangements between us and the Palestinians, I would say that there is an idea going around in many circles in Israel and elsewhere that some kind of an international force in which America might be part of or other countries might be part of, posted on the Israeli border between us and the Palestinians, at least for a while, that may give the Israelis a sense of security, that they will be immune from being immediately the targets of the kind of rockets that they saw from the Gaza. Now, this is one part of it. The other part is what you asked, and that is, yes, I think that the moment Israel feels a sense of insecurity, a sense of its strength waning away, it does not feel secure enough to make concessions. And this is why I personally believe, even though the question did not appear today to any of us, that sanctions against Israel, putting pressure or ultimatums on Israel is in a way not only not helpful, it may bring about, it may backfire, it may bring about the kind of reaction that you do not want to see, which is we're not giving in to pressure. I mean, this is a kind of a knee-jerk reaction that the Israelis have. Put pressure on us, we will not deliver.
Before I get to another one of our participants, Robert Wexler, you wanted to add something to this as well.
Just 2 quick points. I think we're not developing 2 enormously important opportunities in the context of these questions. Number one, I agree certainly that America has a unique role, a guarantor, but the Prime Minister talked about what is actually the most promising opportunity of all, and that is the security guarantee contained within the Arab Peace Initiative. And that opportunity is but an infant one because it hasn't been developed. But more than any other guarantee opportunity that hasn't yet fulfilled its promise, that is what needs to be promoted and embellished upon, and it can provide that kind of security amongst the Israeli people that's required. And number 2, quickly, to a certain degree, justifiably so, the current Israeli administration is being criticized for failing to agree to extend the settlement freeze. But no one actually acknowledges, or we haven't, or maybe I just haven't understood it, no one actually acknowledges that there is a settlement freeze, that everyone wants a commitment to continue. So the freeze doesn't run out until the end of September. So why doesn't Abu Mazen and the Arab world actually declare a partial victory and say, you know what, the most unlikely Israeli prime minister that we could have ever imagined actually implemented a freeze, not perfect, you can find faults, but he actually implemented a freeze, and let's take him up on his desire to go to negotiations and call him on all of the promises that he has made, and hold the American president, if I were the Palestinian side, to a standard of fairness, and ask the American president to articulate what his vision is for the purpose of going to direct negotiations. And that would actually move us forward.
I'll come to you in just a second. But didn't Benjamin Netanyahu also relabel the term settlement and said that certain constructions weren't settlements, there was something else? I seem to recall there was something where he re-described them, redefined them. In Jerusalem. Yeah, but
the settlement in East Jerusalem is still continuing. There is no freeze at all there. But even in the West Bank, there is so-called partial freeze. Public buildings is continuing. And buildings which was already in the first stages, there is continuation. Benny Begin, important minister in the Kitchen of Seven, said that in the last months, the number of houses which was built is much more than the equal phase in last year. That's what he said. I want to answer about why Abu Mazen is not taking the opportunity to say that this is the freeze in the West Bank and to go on to declare victory and to give Benjamin Netanyahu a chance. First of all, the Palestinian Authority and President Abbas gave the Americans and Benjamin Netanyahu a chance by the so-called proximity talks. And meanwhile, the proximity talks is going to be terminated, and the result of these proximity talks until now is big zero. Nothing. At any topic discussed, there is no real or any progress. I think that in the direct negotiations, the situation will be the same. The gap is so huge that cannot be bridged by this composition of coalition because of ideology. And to that statement saying that Israel, when Israel is so strong and powerful, it is much more flexible, I think that the reality is totally different. totally different. When Israel is feeling powerful, it can proceed on. It had been said by Riz also. The withdrawal from Lebanon was not because Israel felt it is so powerful. The so-called disengagement from Gaza was not because Israel felt so powerful. And the assumed release of 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange with Gilad Shalit in the future, not because Israel is feeling so powerful, but according to some articles written in some Israeli papers, I don't want to endorse the slogan, Israel understands power. Maybe Danny Rothschild will say so, maybe Colette Avital or Yossi Beilin. I don't want to endorse the slogan, but this is the reality. The Israeli government will not release 1,000 important prisoners for the sake of Abu Mazen. They will do it for Hamas because there is a kidnapped Israeli soldier. This is to say that the so-called Israel feels much more easy to be flexible if Israel is so strong is not so correct.
Dr. Dibi, thank you very much. Just if you can push that button, just make sure we have the... sorry to keep you waiting there. We'll get just two quick questions and then get to you, and then we'll move the mic forward to you, ma'am.
Okay. My name is Nadia Bilbesi. I'm a journalist with NBC Television, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. We have different opinion about how the American administration can be involved in finding a solution, and I just want to pick up what Mr. Wexler said, that do not pressure Israel because it doesn't work. It doesn't yield any results. And you said also that the U.S. cannot impose the solution, and this is something we heard even during the Bush administration, that they cannot have the peace more than they wanted. On the other hand, when President Obama put a precondition of total freeze on settlement activities, and the Israelis said no, the administration changed 180 degrees, and they said, fine, now we wanted to go for direct negotiation. And they seemed to shift the pressure on the Palestinians. On the other hand, President Obama doesn't seem to be the Bush senior or Baker in terms of using the loan guarantee, another measure of pressurizing Israel. I wanted to ask the Israelis, and I agree with you that we need to articulate the administration position practically, what the US president wants to do and how can he move forward. And I want to hear it from the Israeli perspective of what exactly President Obama can do. Secondly, we heard so many things this morning, but nobody mentioned Hamas, which is the elephant in the room. Now, the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, as we all know, has the right to negotiate on behalf of the Palestinian, yet it doesn't make Hamas irrelevant. So I wanted to ask you, at what stage do you bring Hamas into the to make them part of the solution as opposed to be part of the problem? And we heard very often from Khalid Mish'al saying that he's willing to recognize Israel if they withdraw to the 67 border. So how do you bring them, and how do you make them a player in the process as opposed to be just the outsider who's going to sabotage the process? Thank you.
The first part, in terms of what President Obama can do, Yossi Beilin, if I could get your perspective on that.
First of all, I believe that since I don't think, and I agree with my friend Dr. Tibi, that the gap is huge, huge, and I don't see how in negotiations you bridge it. Because it is not that both sides have the same aim to solve a problem, and the question is just how can they do that? There is an ideological gap. And there is, in my view, no chance to get to the permanent solution now. Then you need the Americans. You need the Americans in order both to suggest, I believe, their guidelines for solutions, or even modern guidelines, and also to suggest something which might bring the parties closer to a solution rather than black and white. Either it's the same situation, status quo, or a permanent solution. And it is in many ways in his hands. About Hamas, Hamas is not, first of all, Khalid Mashal never said that he would recognize Israel. He never said it. He says if Israel withdraws from the West Bank to the 67 borders, then we will consider very seriously a long ceasefire with Israel. This is what he said, and this is the formal view of the Hamas. Hamas is not in the situation of the PLO 20 years ago, when they said, you are talking to the wrong people, recognize us and we will represent the Palestinian people. Hamas is saying we are not going to recognize you, talk to you, or make peace with you. But if the other Palestinians will be foolish enough to recognize you, to talk with you, and to make peace with you, and if it is brought to a referendum, we might consider very seriously the results of this referendum. This is what they say. So it is not a matter for us to say it is artificial to talk only to the PLO. We want Hamas in the room. Because even if we say it, and I personally believe that one should talk to everybody. We cannot boycott anybody. But I don't want to talk to moderate Israelis. They boycott us exactly as they boycott the most extreme Israelis. For them, we are all the same. And I don't think that it is in our power, even if we want it, and I'm not sure that we are eager to do that, but even if we want it, I don't think that such a thing is possible. It might be a change in Hamas, and if eventually Hamas becomes part of the PLO and we negotiate with the PLO, then it might be better for us to have the whole Palestinian people under one umbrella. But it is not up to us to do that.
As I have overrun so much, literally one line, please, Colette Avital, and then one from you as well. So, Colette first, please.
I think the Hamas has nuisance power, and they can destroy, they have the power to destroy any kind of an agreement. This is why, number one, I believe that there should be again some kind of unity talks between the Palestinians. And B, I would say that perhaps the formula at the time adopted of what was called the prisoners' document, meaning let the PLO negotiate and whatever they will agree will be submitted to a referendum, might be the right kind of solution. Again, I think that maybe the solution with the Hamas will come over time, but this is an interim kind of solution with them. And basically that's.
Thank you. In terms of the American role in the peace process, in fact, they have total monopoly over the peace process. The problem with the American role that they are not allowing European to interfere, or the big powers, or the permanent members in the Security Council. Actually, they want Europe as a payer, but not a player. That's what they used, the Europeans. And even when they say Arab role, actually, sometimes they push Arabs to convince Abu Mazen for more concessions, for going to, but they won't allow them to help to contribute. The imposed settlement. Americans alone, I don't think Mr. Berlin can impose outline of a solution or impose settlement. It has to come from other permanent members, with the Americans turning a blind eye, not taking veto. But Americans, they are not capable nor willing. For different reasons, I can discuss it until the morning with you. Americans cannot. Thank you.
And please forgive me for not being able to get the question to you. There will be more Q&A later in the day. There's so much, of course, to discuss on this topic, but we push ourselves to the limit, and I thank you for giving me the extra time, Mr. President. You know, one thing, people are starting to see signs, you know, that there is signs of change. And just I leave you with one thought as we wrap up this session, that it's important to read those signs correctly. And the story I tell to illustrate this is of a policeman in Virginia, in the DC area where I live, who pulled onto Route 10, driving along, and he noticed a car crawling along very, very slowly. So he was like, why is this car driving so slowly? He followed it for a little while, then he thought, this is dangerous, I'm going to pull it over. He pulled over the car and found it was filled with elderly ladies, very elderly ladies. Elderly lady at the wheel and the passengers, and he noticed the passengers, the old ladies sitting in the car, they were like ghostly white, terrified, they looked terrible. So he said to the woman driving, he said, what are you doing? You're going, I mean, your speed is, you know. She said, I'm not speeding. He said, no, I know you're not speeding. You're actually going too slow. She said, I just did the speed on the sign. He said, what sign? She said, the sign with the speed limit. He said, she said, I saw the sign that said 10. So I was doing 10 miles an hour. He said, no, ma'am, that's not the speed limit. That's the name of the road. It's Route 10. It's Route 10. So she was embarrassed and said, I'm really sorry. I didn't realize. He said, well, I'm going to let you off, but before I let you go, I've got to ask you, your passengers look in a terrible state. Are they okay? She said, they'll be fine in a minute. We just got off Route 120. So when you read the signs, it's very important that, that you read the signs correctly. Now, one thing I've been asked to tell you all that lunch will be served in the room located to your right. So I guess that's that way. And I want to thank very much President Fernandez and the panel for the first session. Please give them a warm round of applause for their contributions.